Hi, local pastors. This is a conversation that is all about legality, worship, copyright, and some of the things that you need to know right now in order to bring the best that you can to your congregation. So with me, we have Heather Kimmel, General Counsel for the United Church of Christ, Rachel Heckenberg, the Executive Director of Pilgrim Press, and Sue Blaine, the Minister for Worship and Gospel Arts. So all the people that you are asking lots of questions to are here, and I did some crowdsourcing of questions, and I'm going to bring them in. So to start, it is a wild time. You don't have the capacity to care about any of this. So just what's the worst case scenario? If we're not engaging copyright, we're just doing what we have to do and moving through.
Hi, Chris, I'll take that one. So we always start from the proposition that copyright is a social justice issue, and it's not just a justice issue for the people who are trying to figure out licensing and who are dealing with all of the stuff that's going on right now. It's also a justice issue for the people who have created the works that we are using. And we need to make sure that they get paid for the works or they get credited for the works. If you make the decision not to get permission to use a work, then if you are found liable for copyright infringement, the owner of the copyright of that work will automatically be entitled to what we call statutory damages, meaning they don't have to prove that they lost any money by you using the work. Just you using the work is enough, and that will cost anywhere between $750,000 and $30,000, depending on the court's decision. And they take a variety of factors that are too complicated to get into right here into account. But if it gets to that point, you will also have incurred significant fees in terms of attorney's fees, litigation, court costs, and all of that. So copyright is a pretty serious and can be pretty devastating financially to a church.
Thank you so much, Heather. Another question that came up about virtually streaming all of this is about privacy and prayer requests. So when thinking through lifting up people in prayer in very digitally public ways, what advice do any of you have for pastors who are trying to mitigate the do's and don'ts of that?
I'm happy to start with that. I would encourage people to think about it as though they are talking to a stranger on the street and what information they would not want to share with a stranger on the street, because we don't know who is accessing these recordings that we are posting online. And so when you raise up a prayer request, like Mary Sue is in the hospital recovering from gallbladder surgery, I am feeding her dogs while she is in the hospital, automatically everyone knows that Mary Sue is incapacitated and her house is empty. So that can put Mary Sue and other people in quite a bit of danger. The other things that you want to make sure that you are being sensitive about is whether people want this personal health information to be circulated to others. I find this to be a concern not only in virtual worship situations, but also in regular worship situations, that it may be better for the pastor to collect prayer requests in a non-public way, either through email or by phone call or something like that, so that those can be taken into account without sharing that confidential information.
It is confidential, but I've heard that is not a HIPAA violation in the same way. So I want to nuance that a little bit. So, however, if we're sharing prayer requests with the stranger on the street prime, then it's not a violation of HIPAA per se, because we're not medical care providers, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
I think also that pastors can begin to encourage people who sometimes use the prayers of the people as a kind of announcement time to, if they know that one of their members has a significant illness, that they tell that to the pastor privately, and that they give a very minimalist, pray for Jane in need of healing, that kind of thing. But if they feel a strong need to be communicating this, let them do it directly to the pastor.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift over into copyright and intellectual property. So first, with intellectual property, there's a question about how do pastors who are now putting everything out into the world protect their own intellectual property? And this is probably Heather and Rachel both.
Yeah, so protection of copyrighted materials can be complicated. The short story is that once you create a work, it's protected by copyright. You don't have to register it for it to be considered copyrighted, but you do have to register it to file a copyright infringement lawsuit. So when pastors are putting information out there, they're putting their works that they've created out there, I think it's important to note on that document that it is protected by copyright, which we do with the little C in a circle and the year that it was created and the owner of the copyright. And also, it's a good idea to put, if you are willing to let others use this, the terms that you are willing to let others use this under. So if you want to say this is for use by all United Church of Christ conferences, associations, and local churches for use in worship or another nonprofit or educational use, all other rights reserved, that would be one way to do it. There are many good online resources about license terms for copyright, especially in terms of open source things. And Rachel or Sue may have more information about that too.
There's nothing much to add from my perspective. Heather's making the great essential point, which is if it's out there in a concrete fashion, it is copyrighted. It becomes difficult if you try to pursue action against someone who uses what you've put out there. So this has already been true in terms of if you put your sermons online in blog form, for example, if you put your sermon as a PDF on your website. I mean, many of us already put information and created works out there in public ways. And it's a matter of whether or not you want to be able to pursue legal action if you find out someone's been using it. But it is copyrighted by being in a concrete form that can be traced and dated.
Thank you. So now we're at a point, I mean, not now, always. We tend to take things from multiple places and share them for making meaning and faith formation. Because everything is digitally recorded and out there, we are hyper attentive to copyright now in ways we and some of our churches may not have always been. So I want to just kind of invite an overview of some of the other copyright things that we need to know. And I'm going to invite Heather to talk, and I'll share my screen at the same time to show some of where this information lives, and you can find more.
Sure. So the national setting has online both a document, and that one right there, Copyright and the Church, where it has a lot of good information about copyright, seeking permissions, and especially in terms of music and how to find the copyright owner and those sorts of issues. And there's also, and I'll wait for Chris to go back to show you where that is, but there's also a YouTube video that I created that has a lot of good information about copyright and the church for churches who want to learn that information in a different format.
And yeah, that YouTube video, it lives.
So if you look in the same place you were looking, down at the bottom where it says copyright and the church, and you expand that, there's two listings, one that says copyright and the church, and then the second one on the bottom is a video.
Oh, that one's not coming up easily.
I'm happy to share my screen.
Oh, thank you.
So if you go to worship resources right here, and you go to the bottom and it says copyright in the church, and there is this one right here, which is the document that we just looked at. And then there is a copyright and local churches presentation. I'm not going to click on it because it auto plays the minute that you click on it, and we don't need to broadcast that here, but that is a pretty robust presentation for churches. And I'll stop that share now.
Fantastic. And I know that, I mean, there's some specific questions that are related to that too. I'm just going to kind of quickly go through them. And I invite anyone to hop in as appropriate. So is permission from the artist enough to share something?
No. It depends. Oh, actually, the more precise answer from my perspective is it depends. So if an artist or a writer has worked with a publisher, it's most likely that the publisher manages the rights. So if someone wants to use one of part of a book, the copyright is managed by the Pilgrim Press, or part of a hymn where the copyright is owned by the Pilgrim Press, just because you go to the artist or the author, because we, the publisher, have the responsibility of managing it, it may not be okay for the author. It might not be okay for the author just to say, of course, you can use my things.
So that comes into play too, because a lot of people are reading portions of children's books.
And a corollary to that is the artist might not be the one that owns the copyright. They might have created the work, but they might have transferred that ownership of the copyright to someone else who owns it. And what we really need to do to make sure that in terms of copyright infringement, that our I's are dotted and our T's are crossed, is we need permission from the copyright owner. And as Rachel stated, very important to get permission from whoever else has a license that might have rights to that as well.
So what happens if I'm a pastor, I'm emailing out a order of service and I include a link to a YouTube video that is the anthem?
So in general, emailing out links is fine. The issue comes when whoever is running the online service clicks that link and starts to broadcast that YouTube video over the platform that the service is being broadcast on. That's when the problem happens. So emailing out the link is fine. Rebroadcasting the YouTube video can be a problem, because the YouTube license is usually just for personal use, not for rebroadcasting.
Speaking of the YouTube license, there's been a couple of copyright claims via YouTube music videos that are appropriately claimed, and the YouTube is wrong in saying you couldn't use this. And some of it's tune related and some of it's lyric related, and there's no monetization involved. Is there any way to prevent that, or something that folks should be attentive to?
So what YouTube is going to do, what YouTube does to protect itself and to enforce its own policies. So if you have an argument with what YouTube is doing, you have to take that up with them and try to convince them. There's no really outside source that you can go to convince YouTube that it is doing something wrong.
YouTube does what YouTube does. Heather Kimmel. I know a lot of people are also seeking some, like, the magic phrase. How do I appropriately attribute this after I've gotten everything I need to get? What recommendations do you have for folk in that?
As far as attribution goes, I just want to make it very clear. This is also one of those Heather Kimmel phrases. Attribution is not a substitute for permission. So if you have everything else that you need, including permission, then you should know how to attribute it, because the artist will the copyright owner will tell you how to attribute it. If they don't, you should ask them.
Final bit on copyright before we move to some things you can use. Is a question about specifically to the particular kinds of copyrights churches often get, like one license and all of that. Sue, you want to start speaking to that piece? I know you have a lot of that, and then we can pitch it over to wherever appropriate.
Well, most of the music that our churches are using are covered either by onelicense.net or CCLI. OneLicense.net in particular covers publishing houses such as Pilgrim Press and GIA and Hope Publishing, which have so much of the hymnody that we rely on. So OneLicense.net is a very good investment to make. CCLI covers much of the newly developing praise music, And again, if that is the genre that your church enjoys, you should look to CCLI. There are other places. Convergence Music Project is one that is doing more contemporary praise music that has a more progressive cast. They don't necessarily come under established licenses, so you should be in touch with them. And all of these email addresses are online in the famous Google Doc that we prepared for worship. So also, we are contacting UCC composers and asking them to create videos of their own music that they have, can give permission to use. And so we are posting that on the website as well. And we're updating that every day.
This is what you can use.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get to this via the, oops, doing that wrong. This page on ucc.org/coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these resources are here, including worship music and copyright, and more.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that folks have about this is that a lot of these licenses are asking for the anticipated numbers of people who will be seeing it. So what advice do you have in terms of whether it's how many people do we guess in the streaming? How do we measure the children that we're in conversation with? Is it, any of that?
A number of our churches are reporting much larger congregations now that they've gone online. I don't know how you would count that. I think, start with the number of people in your congregations, the basic folks that you expect to be there. I think that's an honest number. And then if you begin to be able to document more, I guess you can renegotiate with the license grantor, but I'd start with the number in your congregation.
Yeah, I know that gets complicated when we start to live stream because sometimes the metrics that you're getting from Facebook or YouTube or any other place are going to show you whomever's just even peeked in. And oftentimes that's a lot of people, even though you might want to consider some of the metrics about who stayed for a minute or longer. So that gets kind of more deep into the hypothetical bowels of the internet. However, we can have more information about that as we continue to learn in future conversations.
I think you're planning for a certain number. Probably pastors are planning for the number of folks who typically show up for a worship service. So again, I do think that's an honest starting place. And then beyond that, we learn as we go.
Any other advice for people regarding copyright before I move on to another question?
I just want to say, make sure that you check the terms of the license that you're using. There are a variety of copyright licenses, as Sue mentioned. Not all of them are for streaming or broadcasting. Some of them are for sheet music, some of them are for lyrics. So just make sure that you have the appropriate license to do what you want to do. I also find that these companies that sell copyright licenses can be very helpful. If you call them and say, this is what I want to do, what license do I need? They can generally be pretty helpful.
Mm-hmm. I found that too, because it's very complicated and they want to help.
And truly, that's one of the reasons why publishers work with these clearinghouse licensing sites, because it would be an overload for any single publisher to try to manually grant permission and assess every license request from every single entity using some part of any single hymn, for example. And so that's why we use clearinghouses, which is what I call them, such as One License or CCLI. And it really is, although you should know who holds or manages the copyright, especially as it relates to music, it's a potentially more efficient starting point to go to a place like One License or CCLI.
Okay, so I'm going to shift a little bit to some other questions. I have a general question about all of this live recording for you, Heather. I'm just going to read it out and you can respond as if there are pieces that we haven't already hit, which is, I'd love for Heather to talk to us about recording live worship, coffee hour, pre-worship conversations, and sharing those recorded conversations on a different platform. Probably something that's like, here's the link on Facebook, or here's the link from the YouTube. What are the details that need tending to and the questions that need answering in order to do that safely, ethically, and legally? Oof.
So I really think we've covered everything so far. We've talked about confidentiality and safety of folks' personal information. We've talked about the licensing requirements for, copyrighted music and sermons and things like that. So I think that it's just a question of making sure you have everything lined up to ensure that that's going to happen safely. So I guess one of the things I would add would be congregational education about how we are going to do this. So instead of just saying, hey guys, we're going to do, we're going to jump on Zoom for coffee hour, and then we're going to post that on Facebook. Instead, it's, we're going to do this Zoom for coffee hour, and it's going to be recorded. And so these are the parameters we would like people to keep in mind. Please don't share personal information. Please don't do this. So I think, preaching it and teaching it in advance is going to be really helpful for people to understand that this is not business as usual for church coffee hour.
And I know that some of that is rippled by involving children. While I know that the National Council for Youth Ministers is working on some guidelines about working with children in this time, that's something to be attentive to, particularly in sharing recordings. If children are on them, that you have the permission from the parents, that it's okay to share those recordings out. Is there anything else people should be attentive to in that particular circumstance?
So my advice is always to never. My advice is to never share recordings or photographs where children can be specifically identified. And I know that gets very complicated and hard right now, but I'm not going to back away from that advice. So I think that if people are going to get permission of the parent to do that, and they choose to do that, then they can go forth knowing that there are risks involved in doing that.
Is there a release form that pastors can use, perhaps?
Well, the release form it releases, it depends on the language of the release form. When we're talking about minors, it's very difficult to argue to a court that a parent has released the rights of the minor. They may have released the rights of the parent, but maybe not the rights of the minor. And releases are viewed by courts, especially when minors are involved, as definitely not airtight and pretty circumstantial, depending on the activity that's being involved in the release and the risks that were undertaken when the release was signed.
Thank you. I know that is a conversation that we are consistently hyper attentive to, which is why I wanted to bring that ripple into this space. And there is lots of resources about how to do this well through the insurance board. So I want to lift up their Safe Church resources as a place for some of just engaging generally with youth and with children. So I'm going to shift again to kind of the post-COVID reality. So someone asks, thinking about when they're in the same space, what do we need to be thinking about in regard to our participants? We just hit that. So when we hit the same, that's great. When we get back into the same place, I know that we have a resource in development in between Faith Info and the MESA team about things to be considering about how and when to come back together safely. And this specific question is involving your opinion, Heather. So I'm going to ask you here, which is further down the line. What is the church's liability if they choose to have a worship or an event and then someone gets sick?
So in general, it's really, really difficult to prove how someone contracted an illness, especially when the illness is highly contagious and it exists in different facets of our life. It is probably a different question if there is a law or an emergency order in place and the church decides to hold a gathering that is contravenes that order, the liability questions might be different. But in general, if a gathering is held and a person gets sick, there will not be a good way to prove that that's where the illness came from.
Thank you so much. So as we're wrapping up, is there any closing thoughts that the three of you would like to offer for anyone watching this presentation?
I'd only say, we'd certainly much rather people ask than not, and just sort of make assumptions. And it's difficult for so many reasons right now, right? But to worry over the legalities and to just sort of take a shot in the dark and make your best guess. We'd much rather people ask, because we can offer some clarity across the different work that we do and give people guidance and some sense of reassurance out of everything else that's being worried about. We can offer some concrete tools and steps and resources and information. So even though I'd rather, from this perspective of Pilgrim Press, I'd certainly rather people start at one license and ask the questions there. I mean, good heavens, we're here and we're happy to answer questions.
And I would offer appreciation for all that pastors and local musicians are doing right now. This has been such a radical reorientation of what we do as a matter of course in worship. So to be taking these copyright and other legality issues seriously is very important. And as Rachel says, we are here to help. And so thank you.
I would just echo what Sue and Rachel have said, absolutely.
So pastors, lay leaders, those of you who are trying to pull this all together and learning new things right now and doing your best, know that we at the National Setting are praying for you. We are lifting up you to the divine every single day, and we know that it's a lot. So do your best, reach out for help. We're here for you, and be blessed into your day.